Hello, and welcome to Temple of the False Pod, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
Tonight we are talking to you about a deck that Bruce and I wanted to talk about. You know? It's a deck that I took from a pre-con, upgraded a bit, took a bunch out, kind of scrapped a bunch, and built it up to 100 cards. It's my Syr Gwyn deck. Syr Gwyn, does she have a subtitle?
Syr Gwyn, Hero of Ash Vale.
Hero of Ash Vale.
Which really says a whole lot about the place when the name of the place is Ash Vale. Like, it leaves a little to be desired. You know, it's not Sunny Vale, it's not, Glorious Tree Vale, it's not Golden Vale. No, it's Ash Vale. I'm like, you're the hero of an Ashen Vale. Come on, Syr Gwyn.
I mean, she's a badass knight that's carrying a flaming sword. I wonder, is that sword, and I'm going to quickly look this up because I just thought of it, is that sword Embercleave?
Or more importantly, is that flaming sword the reason that Ash Vale is the ash?
Ooh. Good questions for any of our Vorthos listeners out there. I'm sure there are plenty of you. Anyway, let's start off with describing this card. Syr Gwyn, Hero of Ash Vale, legendary creature, human knight. She costs 3 red, white, black. So 6 total for 5/5. With vigilance and menace, whenever an equipped creature you control attacks, you draw a card and lose 1 life. Another line of text. Equipment you control have equip knight 0. So any equipment you have, you can equip to a knight for 0 mana, which is pretty cool.
I thought that was interesting mostly because, so often when we value equipment, we look at the equip costs as a big part of how you decide what equipment is worth it. And generally speaking, if the equip cost is over 2, you're taking a long, hard look to make sure that this is going to be a piece of equipment that you're actually going to use, that has the value that comes with a 3 or a 4 equip cost or more. So if your deck is mostly knights, your equip costs are now 0. Okay, that opens up a whole new world of equipment for you. So, Andy, I am looking forward to going through the deck and seeing what sort of choices you've made and chatting about all this. Assuming you decided to put any equipment at all.
Surprisingly, there's 23 artifacts in this deck, and I believe probably 20 of them, I didn't count, are equipment. Let's see, 1, 2...
Well, to be fair, I did count. And there are 17 pieces of equipment in this
17.
deck. 17.
Okay. That's
perfect.
Which,
honestly, you know what? I'm going to jump right into my first question. I know you've played this deck numerous times, so has 17 pieces of equipment been too much? Now, obviously, I've looked at the deck, and there are some pieces of equipment that are clearly designed to protect Syr Gwyn. There are some pieces of equipment that are there they have very specific purposes. Mm-hmm. And then there's a handful that are there just to make that creature or all of the creatures or however better on the attack. So if it was just 17 pieces of equipment that you were just looking to load onto knights to make them bigger and nastier or evasive, I'm confident that 17 would be too many. So tell us about your experience with the deck.
So I've played this deck 4 times. I've made minor tweaks here and there already.
Right.
I took the 60 cards that was the Brawl deck. I stripped it of a bunch of those cards. I think I ended up keeping other than basic lands or other than lands. I ended up keeping 16 total cards, which is significant. That said, that's hardly a dent in what this deck can do. So out of the 4 four-ish times that I've played it, I know that this deck is far from perfect. I don't expect it to be. And I think that what you've touched on is a definite drawback to what I have set up now. There is definitely a crap load of equipment that I have definitely seen their share of just sitting there on the battlefield, whether it's because Syr Gwyn's not out yet or have fallen off and I haven't had the chance to put them onto anything or found reasons to use them. I think some of them can go probably in place for creatures, because I think that that's the biggest thing that I've found so far, is that even at 26 creatures, which is, I mean, it's a quarter of the deck, people are expecting the creatures to get big very quickly, especially with the equipment, that it's very hard to get creatures to stick. So I think putting more creatures in would probably be helpful. And I think I've also played Syr Gwyn in kind of a huddled together brawl deck on Arena a handful of times. Mm-hmm. And I always kind of find the same thing where it's either very hard for your opponent to get rid of Syr Gwyn, in which you're home free. You kind of stack her up with all the equipment or kind of spread the equipment around to your other knights, and you draw a lot, you lose a bunch of life, but ultimately you're this powerhouse that kind of gets through. Or you can't get Syr Gwyn to stick, and then it's just costing more and more and more, and then the rest of your synergies fall apart because they were relying on you to have that draw engine or the equip cost be reduced. Having things like Hammer of Nazan I put in there makes not only Syr Gwyn that much easier to protect, right, but also all of your equipments come in attached to something. For those who don't know, Hammer of Nazan, the first line of text says that whenever Hammer of Nazan or another equipment enters the battlefield under your control, you may attach that equipment to target creature you control. So you play that, equip it to Syr Gwyn, and after that, your equipment's just attached to things as you cast them.
Hammer of Nazan also would work nicely when you find yourself in trouble with not being able to get Syr Gwyn out. Because definitely. At least you can get it equipped initially for free. Right.
Yeah, and that was like partly the reason I put it in there. I mean, honestly, I got this in a pack of Double Masters. I don't think I would have found the card like otherwise.
Right.
And the great thing is, once Syr Gwyn is protected, you can just move your equipment freely, like willy-nilly. Just
right. But yeah, because you can attack with a group of knights, and then as soon as, if you had to tap them because they don't have vigilance, you can easily move all of that equipment onto untapped knights that are there to block for you and gain the benefit there. Which is, in theory, to me, something that equipment was always supposed to do, but rarely ever did, because most of the time you swung with everyone. So
Audric Lunarch Marshal was one of the first additions for creatures I put in there. I knew he wasn't a knight, but I knew that he just ended or if I had Syr Gwyn out with Audric, everything now is Vigilance and Menace. It makes things much more murkier for my opponents in terms of blocking, but also I then get to keep up all my blockers. Same with Indestructible, Flying, etc.
So one of the other questions I had was, so what sort of restrictions did you have when you put the deck together?
So when I first started putting this deck together, I had the Brawl deck sitting on my shelf for a couple months. We were a couple months into quarantine, and I was like, I want to make something out of this. And I want to... because I generally love doing silly tribal things. Not to say that Knights is a silly tribe, but I feel like tribes end up more or less falling into place. They're like really easy to build for the most part, because you can generally see very clear distinctions of like, oh, these are the good knights, these are the bad knights, these things help knights do really well. Right. And I was like, you know what, I just kind of want to make an easy deck to put together that doesn't end up costing too much, and like I think if I was to buy this deck with nothing already, it would probably end up being a little much, and honestly the restrictions I ended up giving myself for this deck were like the same restrictions I end up usually giving myself for most decks, where it's like, all right, most cards I want to keep under $2. I want to try to keep all cards under $5, and that doesn't count the cards I already have. You know, I've got a couple of the shock lands. I've got Sword of War and Peace. So it was either like, if I already have it, great. If it's under $2, amazing.
Right.
Other than that, it was like under $5. And obviously there are some that are still above that. But I was like, I just want to get, for a first draft or a second draft, I want to figure out where I want to go with this deck, see how it works out, and then refine it from there in terms of like de-optimizing it for my budget.
That makes sense. So we've mentioned it a couple of times already. Now, Syr Gwyn costs 6.
Yes.
So how heavily does the deck rely on Syr Gwyn?
At first, it relied pretty heavily on it. Like I had mentioned before, Odric was one of the first things I put in there because I wanted to spread that vigilance and menace around. I had a few things that give flying to my other creatures, so Odric kind of helped out there. But other than that, it was a very knight-heavy deck, and a very artifact-heavy deck. And then I started putting in the support pieces around it that also just kind of made my knights bigger, that made my equipments cheaper or quicker. I have a few things like Sigarda's Aid that make my equipments come in with flash. Right. So as soon as I was starting to add those support cards in, Syr Gwyn became less and less of like a huge presence. So I think by like the second or third time I kind of looked at this deck, she wasn't super necessary for the win, but she always helps out, especially with the equip costs. Her biggest downfall is absolutely her cost. I think I had mentioned this before. They're out of the 4 games, there were probably 2 that I didn't have that 6 mana up front to get her out and going, which is a huge downfall if that's what you're trying to do with the hand that you're given at the beginning of the game. So that said, I think the next step for me to do is to fix my lands. I think I need to bring the total up to 40. It's at 36 now. If not that, bring up some of the other ramp cards. Cut back on the cards that I have seen not do as much. I've got Zealous Persecution in there. I've had it in hand twice during the games that I've played. Once it didn't do as much as I wanted it to do. My creatures lived, but they really didn't get through. And the second time I knew that it wasn't going to do anything to help me. So I just kind of held it.
It just was underwhelming.
Yeah. And it's always interesting too, because I think so the first draft I made of this was between Throne of Eldraine and Zendikar Rising. So after Zendikar Rising came out, I was like, there are some amazing equipments that could go in here. There are some amazing equipment synergies that would be great. I added Akiri. I added the two equipments that I mentioned earlier, the kite sail and the maul of the skyclaves that give things flying. And then I think I ended up adding a few Commander Legends cards in the past couple months.
Right.
I think the issue was I wasn't looking too much at the cards that weren't doing anything, and I just ended up cutting a land, and I was like, oh, I'm not going to miss one land, and I ended up cutting it down to 36. Probably, I think the first time I made this, there was probably 38 lands, which isn't bad. It could be better.
Well, I was looking at the land because I'm a land junkie.
Yes.
And the three that I noticed weren't there. So there's the Triome.
Savai.
I noticed that one wasn't there, and Cavern of Souls wasn't there. Now, obviously, Cavern of Souls, there are all kinds of reasons not to run Cavern of Souls. I can think of many, many dollars worth of reasons to not run Cavern of Souls nowadays. So I understand that. Did you think about running Path of Ancestry, or was that just not something that just wasn't considered?
I think Path of Ancestry was more so just I hadn't thought of it. I think.
And for those that are wondering, Path of Ancestry, it's a land. It enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. So in this case, it'll tap for any of the 3 colors. When that mana is spent to cast a creature spell that shares a creature type with your commander, scry 1. When Path of Ancestry first came out, I felt like that this was a card that could go in almost any deck, any commander deck, even if it was a 1-color commander deck, because all it basically says is use it to cast your commander, scry 1. I mean, to me, that by itself was almost worth it. Maybe the enter the battlefield tapped was enough of a downside so that the scry 1 didn't make up for it, but man, it's pretty close. And then when you get it into a theme deck like this, where you're practically casting a knight almost every turn, so you would have the ability to scry 1 because you could use the path to cast each knight on each turn. And it's not like the cost on this card is all that high. I just think that it's a card that sort of slipped by the wayside in the last few years.
I would say so. With Path of Ancestry, I feel like it's a really strong card. I have used Path of Ancestry in a few of my tribal decks, and it works well if you remember to scry. And that's, I think that might be where I usually kind of start to sour on it, is that I've used this card plenty of times.
Right.
And every single time I always forget to scry.
Yeah.
And that's my own fault. I think that this would be a great include, but with a 6-cost commander, it is hard to put in those come into play tapped lands if you're going to be playing them after turn 3. This deck, and partly the reason why I ended up putting in only 36 lands was that this deck more or less tops off at 5 mana.
Okay.
I think I've got 5 cards. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I can see a handful that are right around 5, and then there's one.
I've got
2
I've
or
got
3
4
that
at
are
6.
Okay.
I've got 4 at 6, and then I've got 1 at 7, but it's actually a split card, so it's 2 or 5 at 7 at 1. And then I've got 5 at 5. So it's like a majority of my deck is 4 or under. Granted, a lot of it's equipment that I can just kind of throw down, and
right.
Hopefully something will be able to pick it up at some point.
Cool.
And one of the 6 cost is Circle of Loyalty, which costs less if you have more knights. So, which is kind of why I brought the land count a little down. But after using it a couple times, I was like, this land count needs to go up. If only by 2 or 3.
Right.
I don't think I necessarily need the full 40, but 36 is too few.
Now we had already talked about the amount of equipment in the deck.
Mm-hmm.
So, where's your Sun Forger? Virtually any deck that runs red and white that's focused on some kind of equipment almost always runs Sun Forger. It's a healthy little beat stick, and it also lets you dig for all of the, what seems like almost all of the instants whenever you need them. At least that's how it works in all of my opponent's decks. So, was that a conscious decision not to put it in, or?
It was not, Bruce. And looking at it, even without the unequip, I think just the +4/+0 makes it a great addition to this deck. This deck currently has 8 instants in it, 7 of which are 4 cost or under.
Right.
And honestly, that if I had thought of it early in the process, I don't remember. If I had, the tutor aspect might have been the issue that I had with it.
Yeah.
Usually those come in later for me,
right.
If only because I want to feel how the deck feels naturally, rather than like all right, I'm gonna search for this thing to search for this thing and search for this thing, and then I'm gonna pull out my win cons and play them, rather than just kind of
right. And that's been part of the reason why I tend to run it less and less.
Right.
One, because I feel like I'm always going to find the same card. 2, I regularly forget that it's a red or white instant with a converted mana cost of 4 or less. Not any red or white instant, not any white instant or sorcery, not, I always seem to forget that. And then when I unequip it, then I realize, so now to re-equip it, I need 3 more. So yeah. I always forget that part. And I was thinking to myself, well, with Syr Gwyn out, essentially you can equip it for free, spend a red and a white to unequip, search for that instant, cast it without paying its mana cost, equip the same creature or another knight for 0 again, and then you can unattach again.
Yeah.
So that, if you want to cast 2 instants, it's going to cost you 2 red and 2 white, as opposed to 2 red, 2 white, and 3 more to equip, which sort of really balances out the cost savings, at least for Sun Forger. But I'm also with you about as far as tutoring goes. I prefer to keep my tutors to an absolute minimum. So.
And I think even the restrictions that it has when searching for those instants don't really come up too much with this specific build. I've got one instant that because it looks at the CMC of the card, you can't go get Response Resurgence because it adds the Boros and the 3 red white as a total of 7 mana rather than 2 or 5 because it's a split card. I mean, other than that, all of my instants, even the ones with black in them, are red or white, which is pretty fun.
Right. That's nice.
So
no, that makes good sense. And when it comes to equipment, the thing is, there's always more. There's always more, and it's not even we listed off a handful of equipment, and I know I've seen the equipment that it's in this deck, and I think to myself, you could take out every single piece of equipment in this deck currently, and come up with that many more to put back into it, that you'd just be like, yes. So, you've got some great stuff in here, so I'm looking forward to talking about it. However, I know that we are reaching the halfway point, and I think it's time to throw it over to our sponsor.
Yeah, let's. We'll be right back. This episode of Temple of a False Pod is brought to you by Nomad Outpost.
I know you're thinking to yourself, where did I put my fire shrieker? They never seem to hang around. They're never where you need them. You're always looking for another one. Here at the Nomad Outpost, we've got your fire shriekers. There's piles of them in the back. They're lined up lined up for miles. Our stock on Fire Shriekers is unmatchable. If you're looking for Fire Shriekers, come check us out at the Nomad Outpost. We got Fire Shriekers, we got Colossus Hammers, we got Banshees Blades, Argentum Armor, you name it, we've got it for all your equipment needs. Come check us out at the Nomad Outpost. We're right on the edge of the desert, at least for the next couple of days. These deals, they can't last forever. See you at the Nomad Outpost. Back to you.
And we're back. Thank you to our sponsor. Thank you to you, Bruce, for all your lovely questions so far.
Hey. I am pretty much done with questions.
Oh.
The questions I have from here on in are, I want to talk about these cool cards. Can we talk about these cool cards?
Can we? We can. We sure can.
Excellent. There's one card that jumped out at me right off the bat. So when I look through the deck, I mean, I've been playing Magic a long time. I recognize most of the cards. There were a couple that were a little bit like, what is that? Oh, okay, yeah, I remember. But virtually everything here is something that I have recognized from years of playing Magic. Except for one.
Oh.
This is the one card, and I have I'd never heard of it, never seen it played. Obviously, I hadn't seen it played. I've never even heard of it. Court of Ire. What inspired you to put this card in here? This thing is freaking awesome. Obviously, it's recent because you become the Monarch, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, if you're the Monarch, you're gonna deal 7. I mean, immediately that's going to cause somebody to attack you to get rid of it, to take the Monarch away from you. But I mean, even without the Monarch, 2 damage per turn. That's to any target. So
yeah,
you can kill off a small creature. You can ping a plane. You can hit a planeswalker, and if you got nothing better, you can just dome an opponent for 2.
Beautiful.
I have never heard of this card. So what inspired this card to get into the deck?
The biggest inspiration was just, I mean, I was looking through Commander Legends cards that I wanted to buy. I had decided I didn't want to get like a box just to have it sit here, or I didn't want to get a box just to rip it open. So I was like, I'm going to pick out some singles that I want to get, keep a list, eventually buy them. And I went through. There's a cycle of enchantments that give you the monarchy, that make you the monarch. You become the monarch.
And
it
makes you the Monarch.
Yeah, and so I think personally there needs to be more Monarch in Commander, just because it's a fun thing that keeps the game going, and it's natural card draw. It
100% agree.
It keeps people attacking rather than just kind of stalling out and waiting for their value engines to build up. And on top of it, it does free damage. It does 2 at the beginning of your upkeep unless you're the Monarch, and then it does 7, which is pretty sweet. It's a bit on the high end of the curve. It's 5 minutes, 3 and 2 red, but like, if you've got it, great. But I honestly just want, like, I was looking at the cycle and I was like, okay, I want to get these ones because they give people the Monarch, and this red one just seems to fit the best of the 3 colors for this deck.
Sure. The other one.
Yes.
Now, obviously, I've heard of this card, Overload. Why did you choose Overload rather than the standard Vandal Blast? Because it seems like Vandal Blast is like an auto-include just because it has that option to destroy all of your opponent's artifacts. Now, I like Overload for 1 mana at instant speed. That just solves problems. And honestly, if it's an expensive artifact, it's only 3 mana. It's still instant speed. So, but why the Overload instead of Vandal Blast? Or was that just
The instant speed was definitely probably the biggest deciding factor.
Right.
Vandal Blast is also a $5 card.
Okay.
So like that was the other thing. And I was starting to build this deck when I was cataloging my my collection, and I noticed I had a pile of them. So I was like, I think this would go great. Also, on top of which, you're generally not gonna pay the full 3. You're not gonna kick it as much as you think you would.
Okay.
Because the things that you want to hit are generally going to be things like Swiftfoot Boots, Lightning Greaves, somebody's Soul Ring to just get it out of there. Like, they're going to be 2 or less most of the time. There's definitely going to be a lot of times you're going to go for the full 3, in which case it's just too generic in a red. Really easy to pay, really easy to keep up, and best part is that it's instant. So if it's a thing that you were like, I don't see this as much of a threat, and then they come at you with it, whatever it is, then you can use it then, rather than kind of
rather than have to anticipate it. Yeah. With some of the knights, I'm gonna ask you to talk a little bit about my personal favorite. I had a knight deck. It was a 60-card knight deck a while back, and Kinsbale Cavalier was the all-star in that deck. It wasn't even close. For those of you listening at home, Kinsbale Cavalier is a 4-mana Kithkin knight. It's a 2/2 creature, and it says knight creatures you control have double strike, which does mean, in fact, Kinsbale Cavalier has double strike, but he gives it to all the knights. This card was a powerhouse in my decks, so much so that, and to tell you how long ago it was that my deck was built, that I often referred to it as LeBron, meaning the Cavaliers, and this was before he ever went to the Heat and then came back. So, I often referred to this one as LeBron or just King James. Sort of fit keeping with the Knights of the round, the Knights theme of the deck. But so has Kinsbale Cavalier been an all-star for you, or is this a creature that is from the past that's now just barely good enough to make it in?
I mean, I haven't seen it come up yet in the 4 games that I've played. Just by the nature of playing 100-card singleton deck, but I mean, at 3 and a white, it's just well costed. It's spicy. It does a lot to a lot of my creatures. Double strike. If you haven't played an EDH game where you give a bunch of your creatures double strike, it scares a lot of people. It is fearsome. If anything, like if you have double strike and vigilance, you're on fire.
It makes it so hard for your opponents to block.
Yes.
Because everything turns into chump blocking. You're killing off a lot of their creatures before their creatures even get to do any damage to you. And then the ones that do survive through first strike will almost invariably die on when the second round of damage comes in, and they may take a couple of the knights with them, but man, not many. And when you're talking about lifelink, you're also gaining all that life at that first damage step. So this isn't as though a 2/2 double strike gains you 4 life. It gains you 2 and then 2 more, and that does make a difference. Things happen in between those 2 steps that can pump up a creature, or you need the extra life total for whatever reason.
Even like the small creatures, like Kinsbale Cavalier itself is a 2/2. So on a normal attack, if it's not blocked, it's getting in for 4, and that's not nothing. That adds up a lot. And especially if you have, say, 2 other creatures, it's just adding up to an extent that if you're not being blocked, like you're quickly taking people out.
Just a quick race through. Say, Kinsbale Cavalier with Mace of the Valiant on it. Now the mace gets +1/+1 for each charge counter on Mace of the Valiant, and the creature gets vigilance. Now it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a charge counter on Mace of the Valiant. So let's assume that it only has one counter on it. So the Kinsbale Cavalier gets +1/+1.
So now it's a
and
3/3.
And Vig.
Yeah.
So now it's a 3/3 Vigilant double striker. So just by getting +1, it's doing 2 more damage because of the double strike. So all of your equipment that gives any sort of bonus to your power is actually giving double that. So then you take something that's just stupid, like say, Colossus Hammer. 10/10 and loses flying. Okay, well the Cavalier never had flying, so no downside. The equip cost is 8. Well, that's what Syr Gwyn is there for. Now suddenly your Cavalier swinging in as a 12/12 double strike. That's a game ender if they don't block. It's just, that's just miserable. And it is very easy to look at a lot of these equipment. Colossus Hammer is the big one, but it's very easy to look at some of the equipment and think, +2/+2. Nobody looks at the Sword of War and Peace and says, "Ooh, that +2/+2, that's huge," but it is. Now your Cavalier's a 4/4 double striker, along with all of the benefits that go along when it does damage with Sword of War and Peace. It's just you don't recognize just how good equipment gets with double strike until you swing a couple of times with creatures that have double strike and have equipment on them, and it is impressive. One of the other areas that I wanted to talk about, because I'm a token junkie, you've got 4 different cards here that make night tokens.
Yes. Which actually, one that I had put in a different category also makes tokens.
Silverwing Squadron. I love this card.
Oh yeah.
A flying vigilant knight. It costs 6, so it's not cheap. But its power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures you control. It's
a 6-mana 1/1.
Right. And when it attacks, create a number of 2/2 white knight creature tokens with vigilance equal to the number of opponents you have. So you've just suffered through a board wipe. You play your Silverwing Squadron for 6. On your next turn, you attack. You have 3 opponents. You get 3 2/2 white knight creature tokens with vigilance, and in the midst of the attack, this thing goes from being a 1/1 to a 4/4.
Yeah.
And that's if it came in as a 1/1.
Yeah.
And it's unlikely you're going to be spending 6 mana to put this on the board by itself. But it accumulates that fast. It grows that fast. The other one I was looking at was the Circle of Loyalty. Whereas this spell costs 1 less to cast for each knight you control. So you're never paying 6 for this, because you're never playing it onto a board where you don't have a knight out.
Right.
So, realistically, you're probably looking at 4 or 3 or less. Your knights are all going to get +1/+1. And remember, we just talked about the double strike and the importance of even +1/+1. And then whenever you cast a legendary spell, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. Well, the commander is legendary, and then there's Akiri and Rayav and Sylvia Brightspear and
Ariel
and
Black Blades Reforged
and it just keeps going down the list. So you are gonna get at least a couple of, if your opponents aren't going to remove this, you will be getting multiple knights from this. And even if you don't, for 4 mana, you can tap it and make a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. this is just an easy place to sink your extra mana.
Yeah.
At the end of your opponent's turn. So then you're suddenly getting that extra 2/2 Knight, which is actually a 3/3, because you're getting the plus and plus 1 from the Circle of Loyalty. And it's coming up at the end of your opponent's turn, which means that essentially it has haste, because nobody is able to plan around you playing that, because they don't know what you're going to be doing with that mana until the end of the turn when you actually tap it and make the token.
Yeah.
You can say that 4 mana is a lot to spend for a 2/2 Knight. I say that you're getting a 3/3 Knight with Vig, and 4 mana doesn't sound that bad.
Yeah, especially when the alternative is to just have 4 mana go to waste.
4 mana go to waste. And on top of that, when you're playing a theme deck, if every single creature in your deck is represented by a card, then it gets even harder to really take advantage of a lot of the theme options with the deck. All knights get this, or all of this creature type gets this. Oftentimes you can't put out enough cards to really take advantage of that. So a card like Circle of Loyalty, it lets you really take advantage of that. You can where you can start to take a deck or a creature type like knights, which isn't, knights are not elves. They're not saprolings. They're not soldiers. They're not going to be a theme that allows you to go super wide. But a card like Circle of Loyalty does allow you to get at least a little wide. It also allows you to recover a little faster. So if somebody does play, a mass removal spell on their turn, well, it means before your turn starts, you've at least got 1 knight out on the board already. So you could still swing, but you at least get a start.
Yeah. Speaking of going wide, one of my favorite cards that I put in here, as much of a greed play as it is, s02e03 Lich Knight, which is 2 and 2 black for a 4/5 with menace. Period. Like that in itself is amazing.
Yeah.
But on top of that, if you pay an extra 5 and a black, so a total of 7 generic and 3 black, which is very hard to do. I've never done it before. Total of 10 mana. You also get 8 2/2 black zombie knight creature tokens with menace. So you're putting out, 20 power onto the board, all of it with menace. It's a greed play, but it's even at its worst, even at the 4 mana for 4/5 with menace, it's
right. I would tell you, as a friend, if you're playing to optimize this night theme, that s02e03 belongs in the garbage pile.
Absolutely.
Because realistically, s02e03 is a 4/5 menace knight that costs 4, and 2 of those 4 are black mana. And I know this deck has, some black in some of the costs, but generally not 2 black.
Yeah.
I think Sir Conrad is probably one of the other ones. But
yeah.
When you're running a 3-color deck, you definitely want to get your mana leaning in one direction or the other. So that third color is something that's more of a splash than anything else.
Yeah.
However,
especially once you get to the third black pip, it's a little...
And this is just it. A third black pip, you're spending 10 mana for this. If you're spending 10 mana on one card, you want to be finishing. And this one isn't finishing because those zombie knights don't have haste. All of this is then going to have to sit on the battlefield through an entire turn while everybody looks at your 20 points of combat damage, and that's assuming that there isn't anything on the battlefield that's going to pump those zombie knights, which, let's be honest here, there's going to be something. Or there isn't any equipment. There's going to be some equipment. Realistically, this is never going to make it around the board.
Yeah.
And you already know this. folks, I'm not telling Andy anything he doesn't already know about this. He wants to play for the Christmas land on this one. And you know what? Go for it. Go for it. Because at some point, someday, when he pulls this deck out, 18 years from now, and it will have been played 150 times, and he's going to get to play that Josu Vest, and he's going to get to kick it. And he's going to be like, I know all this stuff's going to get killed. I don't care. I get to do it. And it's going to go all the way around the board, and nobody's going to have the answer. And then you're just going to say, waited 18 years, worth it. Worth it.
Yeah. So before we wrap this up, I want to talk about two cards that I have found extremely surprisingly valuable in my times in red and white. And those two cards are Cosmotronic Wave and Bond of Discipline. Cosmotronic Wave has helped me win the game multiple times. Not necessarily with this deck, but in general. So Cosmotronic Wave is 3 in a red and says Cosmotronic Wave. It's a sorcery. It says Cosmotronic Wave deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. That doesn't matter. Creatures your opponents control can't block this turn. All of your opponents.
Yeah.
Bond of Discipline, very similar. 4 into white sorcery. Tap all creatures your opponents control. Creatures you control gain lifelink until end of turn. So essentially, all of your opponent's creatures can't block, and your creatures get lifelink. So it's one more than Cosmotronic Wave, which is why I usually lean a little heavier towards Cosmotronic Wave. But if you have a board full of creatures and you are having trouble getting through, especially if you know you have either lethal for 1 player or 2 players, or just a big chunk of damage that you're like, you know what? It's time. It's time to do this. Cosmotronic Wave helps you out so much because they're never expecting it. They're never expecting, like, they held up their creatures so that you wouldn't be able to attack them. And now you're being like, you know what? They can't block any of them. That means that they would have to flash out creatures or use utility lands, etc., to get creatures out after this resolves. But a lot of the times, they're not expecting that. It also works really well in conjunction with Response Resurgence, where the Resurgence half gives another combat phase where, again, your opponent's creatures can't block. And it's just a card that I've fallen more and more in love with the more I use it. And it's like, I don't know, 25 cents. It's a common from one of the Ravnica sets, probably Guilds. It's just an excellent card that I have found much great use out of it. And I just wanted to kind of get up on my soapbox and preach about it for a sec.
So, Andy, I want to thank you for sharing your deck with all of us.
Hey, you're welcome.
Know that,
Thanks for letting me share.
Hey. We, as always, as we say at the start of every one of our shows, our decks are not optimized, but they sure as heck are fun. I don't recommend to anybody that you click on the link and follow and go and check out. Well, I recommend everybody go check out Andy's deck, but I don't recommend that you copy the deck card for card. I wouldn't recommend that about any of Andy's decks or mine. These decks are not optimized. We offer this up as here are some cool card ideas that we have. Here's a cool deck idea that we have. Why don't you take it and make it your own? So maybe Cosmotronic Wave isn't your deal, but maybe you've got something else that's kind of funky and weird and bizarre and is a little off the beaten path. Maybe you've got your own version of, your overload, the equivalent of your overload card as opposed to the Vandal Blast. Take these decks for what they are. They're just suggestions, ideas for you. and an opportunity for us to share some of the decks that we play with, that that we have a really fun time playing with. So,
and like Bruce said, like I said at the beginning of the show, our decks aren't optimized. Plays sure as heck are fun. We are the Temple of the False Pod. Thank you so much for listening. I am Andy.
I am Bruce.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Hey everyone, Andy here. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Temple of the False Pod. Just a few housekeeping things here at the end of the show. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, pretty much wherever you can find podcasts. Subscribe and give us a review. It really helps out the show. And it'll show us what you like about our podcast. Also, we've got a Twitter and an Instagram. Our handle is FalsePodMTG, all one word. So be sure to follow us. Feel free to reach out to us there or drop us an email at falsepodmtg@gmail.com and tell us your favorite magic-related story. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again to you and to Bruce. He's Mana Burned on Twitter, and I'm Andy Weekend on Twitter and Twitch. We're Temple of the False Pod, where our decks aren't optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. Have a great night, and may your fifth land be the temple.